And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. He doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'm going to be brief. Professor Arturo Escobar is an anthropologist and emeritus professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is currently affiliated to Universidad de Caldas in Manizales, Colombia. Professor Escobar has developed work on the anthropology of development, social movements, political ecology, with recent focus on ontological and transition design. His work has encouraged us to reflect on alternative ways of thinking and being that have in mind the wide diversity of forms of knowledge beyond Eurocentric academic knowledge. And through his research, he has collaborated with Afro-Colombian environmental and feminist organizations. He's the author of influential books such as Encountering Development, The Making and Unmaking of the Third World, or The Making of Social Movements in Latin America, Identity, Strategy, and Democracy, which he edited with Sonia Alvarez. And his most recent books are Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds, and Pluriversal Politics, the Real and the Possible. And the title of his talk today is Against Terricide, Pluriversal Politics and Transition Design. But before handing it over to Arturo, my colleague Natalia is going to explain today's seminar format. So over to you, Natalia.
Great, thank you, Jessie, and thank you, Ainhoa. So I'm Natalia Buitron, one of the conveners of the seminar. I'm based at the LSC, and I will just tell you how we will run the seminar. Arturo will speak for around 40-45 minutes. Want you to know that we are recording the seminar, but only Arturo's talk. So we will need you to keep your mics muted to avoid interference with the recording. Thank you very much. I see that everyone is being very well behaved so far. After Arturo's talk, we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. And to do this, we ask you that you write your questions on the chat facility, which you find below on the right. Ainhoa, Jessie, and I will be chairing, so we will be asking your questions to Arturo. Unfortunately, we won't allow you to ask the questions yourselves because there are so many of us. This is a very amazingly attended seminar. If you wish to be acknowledged for your question, please introduce yourself and your affiliation before posting your question on the chat so we can introduce you first and then the question. Great, I think this is everything for now. And without much further ado, let us welcome Arturo and his talk.
Okay, thanks very much, Ainhoa, Jessica, Natalia, to the anthropology programs of the London area, to ILAS Institute, and everybody else for joining. I want to echo something that somebody already wrote in the chat. Geoff Goodwin just wrote something simple, but it's very true, which is solidarity with the Institute, solidarity with ILAS. And it is really sad, but it's a sign of the times that the university wants to abolish the Institute. I think there are many, this is reflection of the pressures that many universities are facing today to keep downsizing, and to keep downsizing, especially those programs that are not seen as indispensable to training successful people for globalization and global markets. And it really, we're doing a disservice not only to the universities, to knowledge communities, but also to the earth itself, to the planet itself. We continue to abolish all those programs that can really enlighten humanity in the many ways in which we are going to need to reconstruct our societies, our ecologies, our economies, in ways that are more earthwise, just to put it in a particular way. Thanks also to a few friends who have sent salutations on the chat. That's great to see you all. And I should say that I just literally finished another event about an hour ago. So I'm a bit tired, but I hope it's going to be, what I'm going to say is going to come out clearly. If at any point in time you cannot hear me clearly, I would ask one of the three conveners to please let me know, and I will be pleased to repeat, or if something happens with the connection, of course. Okay, So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a PowerPoint presentation. The virtual is not my natural environment, my natural element. I do much better in person. Those of you who know me know that. I like to pace around and gesticulate, and I don't know if that's the typical, archetypical, emotional Latin American person or what, but that has been my style. So it's a bit more difficult to do it in this constrained format, but at the same time, it's great that we're able to do it. So I'm not complaining about that. So I'll show you the PowerPoint in a moment. I'm not going to, maybe I might jump over a few of the slides depending on the time. I'm going to speak about 45 minutes, beginning now, so until about, I guess it's going to be 2 p.m. my time, 6 p.m. your time. And I usually don't repeat what is in the slides, but I walk or talk around the slides. This time, because it is virtual, maybe I'll do a little bit more reading than usual, but you will have that, and I could send it to anybody who wants to, or the organizers already have it. Okay, so let me share the screen. Just a second. Let's hope that this works well. Oops, sorry, should have been at the beginning. Can you see it and can you hear me well now?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful, great. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today is, I guess I would call it, could describe it in different ways. What are the most recent, I guess, interpretations or readings of the current conjuncture, the current moment, emerging mostly from Latin America, but not only from Latin America, and how, especially in the context of the COVID crisis as well, what do we learn about the crisis for thinking about transitions? So you will notice different words in this title already: Terricide, Pluriversal politics, transition, and design. And these, in many ways, are the pillars of what I'm going to be talking about. One quick comment about the concept of design, because since this is an anthropology seminar, obviously it's not a seminar for designers, but don't let yourself be put off by the concept of design. Just take it as a description of any practice in which humans engage. It's not just what professional designers do or expert designers do, but it's much more than that, as I will show as we move along. Okay, this is a brief outline of the talk. I'm going to be starting talking about the current crisis as a civilizational crisis, and that's a Latin American concept, but it's a concept that is gaining ground in many different parts of the world. Then we talk a little bit about design, not much, and about design because the crisis in many ways is a result of design decisions and design options. That the contemporary world is profoundly designed by human action. That's part of the concept of the Anthropocene as well, of course. Then we'll talk a little bit about transitions, and that's going to be the main part of the talk, especially about what I see as emerging from the territories and the struggles and social movements from Latin America that make sense, the kinds of things that make sense for us to engage in if we want to walk towards that civilizational transition or transitions that many activists are telling us about and have been telling us about for a few decades now. And then a very short conclusion. I think I'm going to be using images as well. I will not explain all of the images. This one is very important to me. I mean, it's a very nice image, I think. It's from the Zapatista art. And we see Monsanto, sort of globalization. Let me just move this. Like globalization sort of injecting its poison, transgenics or glyphosate or what have you, on the territories, lands, and experiences and existence of peoples. And of course, you see the communities trying to defend those territories with a different model of life. Okay. It would be impossible not to engage in this talk and not to talk a little bit about COVID. Many of you have probably seen this piece by Arundhati Roy. I think in my mind is one of the most interesting pieces that I read on the COVID. The COVID is a rupture. This is a piece that actually appeared on the in the Financial Times about 2 or 3 months ago. And it's a warning that we shall not go back to the normal. We shouldn't desire to go back to the normal. We should design instead to really take stock of what the world has been over the past few decades, at least if not centuries, and then try to make change of direction according to that. And in its own way, Latin American feminists have been, this is from a friend of mine, a Black feminist activist in Cali, Colombia, that says, it basically says that the crisis is impacting people differentially, that even those slogans like stay at home and wash your hands are fallacies for many poor people in the world. Many people don't even have access to computers. They don't have access to the possibility of staying at home, are not even maybe washing their hands. So the COVID crisis is making visible the profound inequalities that this capitalist system, which is the true pandemic, is bringing about. I always like this, that a slogan that came out in Chile in the heat of the protests in 2019. No volveremos a la normalidad porque la normalidad era. We shall not go back to the normality, because normality was the problem to begin with. But if not to normality, then what? What happens if we don't want to go back to normality? It would also be impossible to give this talk without talking about the important and in many ways profound uprising around police violence against Black people in the US on the left-hand side, but also in countries like Colombia, where in my city of Cali, Colombia, as those of you who are from Cali who are listening know very well, about 1/3 of the population is Afro-Colombian, and they live mostly in the very poor conditions. And there have been a wave of recent killings of Black youth in particular, which are very much represented in demonstrations and in art, such as these ones, that convey the sense also that las vidas negras importan or Black Lives Matter. So this is part of the context of the civilizational crisis in which we are today, this profound anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-peasant racisms that exist in the world today. For me, there is a concept that summarizes so well what is at stake, and that concept is the concept of Terricide. And more than the Anthropocene is too academic maybe for many people, or even climate collapse or climate change, obviously, that talks about the climate, but the crisis is much more than a climate crisis. The concept of Terricide was coined indigenous movement for Buen Vivir, indigenous movement of South America, good living, especially by amazing Mapuche activist and feminist whose name is Moira Millán, an author as well. She just published a novel recently in Spanish. And the concept of Terricide suggests that not only that we are destroying the earth, but that in destroying the earth, we're destroying the ability of humans, especially indigenous peoples, but not only the indigenous peoples, to survive on the and to survive on the earth. And I like this art by Palestinian artist Monica Hataoum that suggests that the entire globe, that earth, is in conflict. She's talking about socio-political conflict, but we also know that the earth is literally on fire. NASA has documented about 13 million fires over the past 15 years or so. It's not only the fires in California or in Chile or in Argentina nowadays, or in Australia or in the Amazon, but the fires in many parts of the world as well. So we are really, really killing the planet. So we have to ask the question, are globalization, development, design, even the academy, are they sustaining the world, or are they contributing to destroying the world? And of course, this is a simplistic way of putting it. In many ways, they are doing both, or trying to do both at the same time, especially the critical academy, the critical design are trying to move from destruction to sustaining. And we have these entire movements today that are emerging around the notion of collapsology in France, which is a very interesting movement. Extinction Rebellion, obviously, I don't have to tell you anything about that to you who come from London in particular. So, but there are many phases of that civilizational crisis. It's not only the destruction of ecosystems, of mountains, on lakes, but it's also a global change, but it's also this. I mean, this is the expansion of oil palm. I've heard that China is developing one of these plantations for oil palm that has over 1 million hectares, which is an amazing component of the Terricide today. In our region in Colombia, the Cauca Valley region in Colombia, we have sugar cane. It's also another phase of the Terricide. But we also can point at, I don't know how many of you have seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, and I would encourage you to do so. It's really, really striking and in many ways horrifying what it describes, the impact of the digital technologies and subjectivity on politics, on the earth, and the creation. This is a Netflix documentary, a very recent one. The creation of that kind of digital transculture that is increasingly global, but that has a very superficial idea of freedom to choose among options that have already been prefabricated through algorithms for the market. So the question becomes, what does it mean to live well in the age of computer network technology? How do we transform our relations to those technologies? I mean, obviously, it's not a question of getting rid of the technologies. That's not impossible to begin with, but reorienting our relationship to those technologies in a very radical and significant way. And that's part of the civilizational transition also that we need to engage in. So there is a call for transitions. The call comes most powerfully in Latin America from indigenous peoples, from indigenous summits at around 1992, this 500th anniversary of the so-called Discovery of America, Conquest and Discovery of America. Indigenous groups started to say that the civilizational crisis was a crisis of a particular civilizational model, meaning by that the model of the heteropatriarchal capitalist modern system, and that we need to shift to different civilizational models. A little bit later on, the World Social Forum process launched the slogan, Otro mundo es posible. The Zapatista also launched this other idea, which is a very wise and powerful idea of un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many worlds fit, which is the idea of the pluriverse. One of the definitions of the pluriverse, and I'm going to go into some more detail later on about this, is precisely that we need to move between this idea of a single world, a single globalized world, made up of just one way of being globalized, capitalistic, individualistic, consumption-oriented, with centered on productivity and competitiveness and the economy, to a world where many worlds fit, where many worlds really become possible. So that's a civilizational transition as a statement. And movement towards what? And there are many ideas, and I've been, for the past decade, I've been collecting ideas about transitions and narratives about transition. A first installment of my interpretation of those narratives was in the book Designs for the Pluriverse. In one of the chapters about those transition narratives. And for instance, a transition towards an ecozoic era, defined, and this is a concept by North American ecologist and theologian Thomas Berry, a very interesting writer, who says that we have to move between sort of this anthropocentric era, the terminal Cenozoic, to an ecozoic era of the House of Life. And I like to explain it also in terms of images, that suggest that the transition has to move along the path of reintegrating, for the human to reintegrate with the earth, to the realization that we are earth beings. Sorry, there is a typo there. It should be earth beings. We are part of this pluriverse. We are part of this ceaseless flow of interdependencies and interrelations. And this is by a young graphic designer and artist from Colombia, Vanessa Roa, who has these beautiful images that conveys mostly for movements. I mean, this is kind of a naive art for movements and activists, but very sophisticated at the same time, because it really suggests that the human is also, we are also nature. We're river and we're mountain, and we are animal and we're plant and we are microorganisms and we are cloud and we're snow peaks and we are all these different things that we don't think of ourselves in that way, but that we have to begin to think of ourselves according to a different way of understanding life, of understanding reality. And that different way of understanding reality is usually summarized under the concept of radical interdependence, or relationality. So these are the academic terms for something that many indigenous peoples and peoples linked to territories have known all along, that we don't exist if the territories don't exist, if the rest of the living beings don't exist. Post-dualist social theory, most of you who are academics know what I'm talking about there. There's a whole amazing new ways of theorizing that attempt to go beyond the dualism, especially the dualism between the human and the non-human, or between humanity and nature. Okay, these are just some other images from, this one is from a painter, North American painter, that has beautiful paintings based on the work of Lee Margulis, the great biologist, her concept of endosymbiosis, of species that evolve inside other species, so in complete cooperation. There are many coming from indigenous events as well, such as these ones, the woman mangrove, the person mangrove, like the women actually from the Pacific coast of Colombia, who live on the mangrove, of the mangrove products on the coastal areas, and so forth. So that what is happening when many of these movements, when many of these groups of people who are linked to territories, whose way of being at least maintain a certain relational character, not completely, because they have been already impacted by globalization and modernity and so forth, and capitalism, that what they are doing when they are mobilizing is activating that relationality, activating that ontology of interdependence. And that's what we're going to be seeing a bit later on. I'm going to skip over this because I'm taking maybe too much time on this introduction. But this is about some of the sources for the post-dual social theory today. Again, very interesting. I'm moving on to the second part that is going to be relatively short, of telling you a little bit about my own narrative about design and why the interest in design. And design, because two different reasons. In many ways, because more and more people are discovering that the world is profoundly designed, and that as we designed our world, the world designed us back. So we are designed by our designs. Digital technologies is a case in point, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But also because there is a growing trend within design studies, is a trend of critical design studies that sees design, expert design, like the design of buildings and artifacts and objects and products and services, everything that goes under the banner of design, has also been in crisis, has been a very important, central element in creating the crisis in which we are today, and hence that design can also be part of the reorientation of things. So that design is in crisis and the world in crisis, and that then we can construe design as in transition, at the service of that larger civilizational transition. To get there, we need to adopt what these design critics call an ontological perspective on design. We don't have the time to talk too much about that, but let me just walk you a bit towards through that idea, beginning with the fact that most of design continues to be very conventional, of course. This idea that we can do everything with design, we can design, redesign the human, redesign the body. We can, with technologies, with nanotechnology and synthetic biology and everything else, we can basically redesign everything that we want to redesign and supposedly make it better. But it's not happening that way. It's not happening that way because design continues to be deeply integrated into the fabric of capitalism and the ontology of separation. So, but as I was saying before, there's a growing movement, it's a small but growing movement within design studies that is beginning to sort of shake the world to design. Is differentiated between the global north and the global south. In the global north, we have movements like design for social innovation, transition design, ontological design, etc. In the global south, there is a whole trend towards very rich, towards decolonizing design, designs from the south, on autonomous design. Together, they constitute what we could see as a transnational critical design studies. So that design, and for me, this is the main line, this is what I take from these trends, that design or designing is emerging as a domain of thought and action concerning the production of life and the making of worlds. So that we're thinking through design as a way of thinking about life and about world making, the kinds of worlds that we're making today. So at the intersection between critical design studies and post-dualist social theory emerges recently this question. This is the articulation by Ezio Mancini and Virginia Tassinari in Italy, in Milano, which is then opening the question where design can move from its anthropocentric connotations and practice and embrace this idea of radical interdependence and making it in a way that is effective as a force of transformation in the world today. And I've been collaborating with them here and there in different spaces, and that's one of the questions that we're trying to tackle today. So why an ontological approach to design? It's a very simple idea that in designing tools, we're designing ways of being. Again, digital technology is a case in point. We have designed these technologies and we are being profoundly redesigned by them. This is from Anne-Marie Willis, this double movement of design, that design designs, that we are designed by our designs, applies to cities as well. We have created the city, but we don't know how the city is recreating us. I just pointed this book because it just came out. It's a reissue of a book by Tony Fry, one of the main ontological design theorists. Very fascinating. This is originally from 1999, but just came out in a new design series that you can find. And in the global south, especially in Latin America, there's a whole movement towards questioning this sort of the centrality, the sort of the Western centrism of design, and thinking about all the designs and designs otherwise, designs from the south, decolonizing design and autonomous design, and maybe then just to mention that taking together all of these trends in the global south and the global north point at the emergence of this ontological political field at the intersection of social struggles and critical design theory or a critical theory. That what we're seeing today, and those of you who might be familiar with the field called political ontology, in which people like Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blaser, and many others also work, anthropologists, that at that intersection between social struggles to defend territories that are based, at least partially, on the basis of radical interdependence or an ontology of non-separation. And critical theory is that intersection is a very powerful intersection today for thinking about transitions, at least. Okay, and in the time that we have still left, it's about 20 minutes. We'll talk a little bit about transitions. And I'm going to start, I mean, this is always such a fraught question, such a difficult question to ask. How do we move then? I mean, if we see that the contemporary crisis is a crisis of a particular model of thinking and doing, it's a crisis of particular way of being, doing, and thinking. That has produced, we can admit, we can agree that it has produced amazing results in many different ways. Have brought about great progress, economic development, all these different things, science and technology, and so forth. But that we're now seeing that that same mode of existence that is in crisis today, that in contemporary Latin American theory, people refer to as something like the heteropatriarchal capitalist colonial modern world system. I mean, that's sort of a jargon from decolonial theory. That then how do we think about something that is different? How do we think about something that is not the same, that it doesn't reenact, reproduce the same way of thinking, doing, and being? So it's a number of groups, more and more groups are focusing on this idea of what then is a radical alternative. This is from a particular group with which I also collaborate, which is called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. You find it easily on Google. If you do the Google for Global Tapestry of Alternatives, it will show up there. It has three main sort of anchoring bases, one in South Asia, particularly India, two in Latin America, especially Oaxaca and Chiapas on the one hand, and the Colombian Southwest on the other. And that radical alternatives are those then that are advancing in the process of dismantling most forms of hierarchy and assuming other principles, not the principles of competitiveness and productivity and the economy and growth, but sufficiency, autonomy, care, justice and equality, and so forth. Now, there are many groups that fit this description partially. I don't think there is any group that is doing it 100%, or maybe a few. But this idea that, oh, this is annoying, that these are attempts to break away with dominant systems and take new paths. So how do we describe those new paths? What does it make it new? This is a description from David Bollier. David Bollier, and I'm going to show you in a moment something from them, and Silke Helfreich are two of the main people working on commons and commoning from an ontological perspective. And David says the following: we don't need a glowing vision. We don't need a utopia right now. You know, it's not the moment of those big utopias, but concentrating on hundreds of smaller scale projects and movements. As they find each other, replicate their innovations, and federate into more coordinated, self-aware polity, that's where things will get very interesting. So this is what he's dealing with, and this is sort of his representation of that. I mean, that came out with the interview. Let me take this off so you can see the quote again. That the idea of how do these so-called or supposedly small scale, place-based, localized, radical alternatives can get to eventually to make a dent on the largest structures of domination and exploitation. Is that really possible or not? Because we don't have good, how do you call it, precursors for asking that question. And contemporary theory is not very good anymore at convincing answers to this question. It's the question of how those radical transformations happen, okay? So, but there are many ideas. I mean, the idea by David is, you know, some people describe it as rhizomatics, confluences, convergences, articulations, alliances, all these different things between different multiplicity of small alternatives in many different parts of the world, that little by little, and actually Ezio Mancini has a very nice metaphor that I like. I had forgotten about it, but I might as well mention it here, which is the idea that all of these small islands of sustainability, I think he calls them, will eventually begin to create an archipelago of different way of being or different societies, and eventually might emerge as a different kind of continent of life or territory of life. Okay. So in this book, Pluriverse, that came out about a year and a half ago, has come out also in Spanish, in Italian, in French, in Portuguese, and I think it's going to be coming out in German as well. Um, we begin to ask the question again of post-development. We begin with this realization that 70 years of development have coincided with an increase in many of the problems of the world, especially the global south, certainly an increase in inequality. Inequality is much worse today than it was then. An increase in poverty for many people, and an increase in the ecological devastation of the earth. So it makes a lot of sense to begin to think again about post-development, about a world beyond development. And I like this metaphor again from Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar, this wonderful Mexican sociologist, feminist sociologist. This was one of the blurbs of the book. And she says, the world is a pluriverse, it's an emerging archipelago of worlds in struggle, inhabited by a constellation of heterogeneous communitarian weavings that sustain life. Heterogeneous communitarian weavings that sustain life. So there is nothing homogeneous about this. Every single attempt at re-communalizing, at defending place and territory is a unique one, but it's one that, if it follows certain set of criteria, will contribute to this significant transformation that we're talking about. So in the book, and this is just very quickly about that book, you'll find there is about 80 entries. I mean, there's 100 entries, but about 80 of them are about alternative notions. Some of them are from traditional peoples, but new. Notions like buen vivir, Ubuntu, Swaraj, and from indigenous North Americans, but also from contemporary theory, degrowth, commons, ecofeminism, and so forth. So a radical alternative has these dimensions. It is based on ecological wisdom, integrity, and resilience. It privileges social well-being and justice, and not growth and economy and competitiveness. Direct democracy, economic democracy, cultural diversity, knowledge democracy, and questions the core concepts of development and modernity, the concepts of progress and growth and rationality and competitiveness, etc., etc., etc. So that's basically what we mean by that. So, and this is, I'm going to explain this, and then I will talk a little bit about each one of these 5 axes. So if we think about strategies, different parts of the world, and this is a reading in many ways that comes from territories and processes on the ground, so to speak. This is not just from theory or from the academy. We can see, even if this is in conversation with the academy and some of the labels also come from the academy, we can see and differentiate these 5 principles or axes of redesign, of transition, or post-development, whatever you want to call them, or doing anthropology as well, like doing engaged anthropology, applied anthropology, etc. The first one is the re-communalization of social life. Since life under globalization has been about individualizing, now it is important to re-communalize. The second one is the re-localization of many activities. Again, globalization has been about delocalizing everything that can be globalized. So now we have to relocalize everything that can be relocalized. The fostering autonomy. The third one comes from Latin American feminisms, especially Black and indigenous feminisms. This insistence that there is no decolonization without depatriarchalization and de-racialization. That is not enough to be anti-capitalist, anti-colonial. We actively have to pursue depatriarchalizing and de-racializing strategies. And finally, and in some ways the most important, is that we have to reintegrate human life, human society with it. And there are many ideas about how to do this, of course. And all together, they point again at this idea of the care for life and the flourishing of the pluriverse. Okay. So for each one of these axes, we can ask questions about what kinds of projects are going on, or we can design that walk along this path, and to relate it to other possible futures different than the future that is offered to us by the powers that be, that we know are not longer feasible futures for most of humanity or for the rest of the living world. Okay, so a few things about each one of them, and I'm going to summarize some of these, but you'll have the text later on. So again, why to re-communalize life? Why is that important? I mean, it's communities is think of the past. Communities are also the site of, oppression and power relations and patriarchy and so forth. And all of that is true. At the same time, we start with the realization that globalization has been a war against everything communal and collective. So that we have to oppose these individual solutions to the crisis offered including by digital technologies that continue to be so individualizing. We start by recognizing that human experience historically has been place-based and communal. And there is something very important about that for the human. And that importance is given form by a concept that emerged in Oaxaca about 20 years ago, which is the concept of comunalidad. Comunalidad is a neologism, is a term that didn't exist before, of communality, meaning by that the condition of being communal. So we're not talking about communities in a simple-minded, holistic way, old anthropological fashion, but it's a new understanding of the community as an open horizon, but also something that is very physical, very material, but that engages and weaves together the material and the spiritual and the human and the non-human, because in the realization that place is a co-evolution, is a co-emergence of humans with their living worlds. And that then is for us to start thinking more in terms of in Oaxaca again, they coined this concept, nosotricamente, nosotrear, nosotrearnos, compartencia. These are terms that didn't exist in Spanish before, but this is the beauty of many of these experiments on the ground, that they're inventing their own lexicons, their own languages. So one might be a resilient community under these circumstances. The relocalization of social, productive, and cultural activities, of course, because globalization had about dispossession, displacement, extractivism, forcing people to migrate. Migration is okay, but not if people are forced to migrate because of politics or poverty. That with the COVID crisis, we're seeing again that those who sustain life are not the businessmen and the economists and the corporations and the entrepreneurs, but those who are on the ground producing food and sustaining each other and their territories and so forth. So relocalize what's possible. Of course, not everything can be relocalized, but there are many things that can be relocalized. And there is a whole wave of different kind of economic thinking that goes along those lines, that includes degrowth economics and ecological economics and commons and so forth. And food is one of those main areas or domains where relocalization is known a lot. I mean, you have heard about all of these. Community-supported agriculture, urban gardens, commons, food sovereignty. And what is this about? This is about reweaving the very complex entanglement or relation elements that involve seeds and soil and knowledge and peasants and producers and markets and local markets and gardens and all these different things. That is what in the long run is going to be constituting what we call food sovereignty. So relocalization is the second important axis. These two books are two important books for me in the context of the two first criteria. Fair and Alive is a political ontology of the commons and the economy, but it's also very hands-on. It's very user-friendly. They have a lot of diagrams and exercises that community groups can engage in the defense and reconstruction of the commons. The same with the book by Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson and their collaborators, Cameron and Healy, Take Back the Economy. This is the third book, and it's a hands-on guide for taking back work, taking back finance, taking back enterprise, taking back the economy in general. So these are two important books, and there are so many other books and ideas that would be relevant to include here. So why autonomy? Because it's impossible to re-communalize and relocalize if the communities don't have autonomy. Because the autonomy is then a political correlate of those processes. It's an antidote to the attempt by globalization to re-globalize what is being localized. So it's very important. Autonomy is a new way of enacting politics. And what is politics today? I mean, politics, and this is the third bullet point. Politics, I say, is the reenactment, the reconstitution of the human and non-human entanglements. The politics is about the reconstruction of the world under other kinds of principles. We're stuck with these principles given to us by the modern economy in particular, the principle of competition and control and appropriation and so forth. And we need to really shake off those principles in our daily lives and in our societies. Okay. There are some guides for autonomous design, and you find an elaboration of the framework of autonomous design in the book Designs for the Pluriverse. So I won't go into detail on this. I'll move along to show the last. Okay, so taking together the first three axes would move us beyond globalization as we know it. It will entail a significant reorientation of how we inhabit the planet and a counter-designing, especially in relation to that modernized middle-class way of life that in Latin America at least, but I think in many parts of the world is being offered and pushed on people as the only option or the best option, as the most desirable option for living. And we know already that this middle class, individualizing, consumption oriented is very decommunalizing and delocalizing and profoundly anti-ecological. So we have to resist the model of that sort of the spatial, architectural, urbanistic, and lifestyle model that is offered to us through the middle class way of life. This is one of the most important axes, the depatriarchalization, de-racialization, and decolonization of social relations. Patriarchy has been around for about 7,000 years. It's not a question about deciding when it started. I mean, there's a debate about that, which is coming back, which is very interesting. Patriarchy is an ontology. It's an enduring ontology. It's an ontology that privileges precisely hierarchies and competition and control and appropriation, and that often results in domination and violence and war. And if we look around, that's what we see in the world today. It's a renewal of patriarchal ways of being. Not only the awful patriarchs that are the presence in countries like the US and Brazil and Colombia and Hungary and the Philippines and so many other places, but in our daily life, so that as Latin American feminists say, there cannot be decolonization or transformation of capitalism without depatriarchalization. And that one of the veins in which feminists have been very active working, especially with the COVID crisis, is again, what does it mean to reappropriate again the goods that are collectively produced and that amount to the reproduction of life? Obviously, Silvia Federici, Rita Segato, Raquel Gutierrez are important presence there. but still is Vampa. There are many, but many communitarian, indigenous, Black and decolonial feminisms that are so important today as well. So, and that this is precisely about repairing the damage done by the capitalist ontology of separation. So moving towards what in many ways these feminist thinkers are calling a feminine, actually Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar, and I put the quote, talks about a politics in the feminine. And the politics in the feminine, I love this quote from Rita Segato, Argentinian anthropologist, one of the main Latin American feminists in the present at the moment, that today we need to choose this path of interdependence, this path of reconstituting community, and that if we do so, we realize that the strategy from now on is feminine. So what does it mean, feminine? And I would need much more time to convince you, maybe, of many of you who are already thinking that this is an essentialist statement, that there is nothing essentialist about this. It's a very profound, complex, sophisticated framing of a feminist politics of place, a feminist politics of the feminine, a feminist politics of care, a feminist politics of an ontological politics that is different and that is dysfunctional to capitalism. So this is one of the very important criteria for transitions. And finally, re-encountering the earth. So because everything in the last instance is about the earth, where we call it earth, Gaia, Pachamama, we can utilize the concepts from biological complexity. We can talk about the sacred. There are so many ways of talking about the earth today, because earth is in everybody's mind. Well, not everybody's, but in people who are struggling to change things. And that is a horizon for a renewed practice of living in the context of global capitalism. That we should not let ourselves be influenced anymore, but that perverse equation that says that to reduce poverty and bring about development, we have to extract natural resources from the earth. We basically have to destroy the environment, that we should oppose it and replace it by another one that says that what is good for the earth is good for the people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the economy. So we have to modes of doing also good for the earth because they are good for the people. Okay. I'm going to skip over this. There's all this in the context of a struggle. This is a struggle of the NASA indigenous people in Southwest Colombia that are engaged in the movement called the Liberation of Mother Earth. It's like most movements, it's a very divided movement at the moment, but it's a very radical movement. And the basic insight is that the earth is enslaved. As long as the earth is enslaved, so we are all humans and non-humans. And so we can all, wherever we are, we have to engage with the liberation of Mother Earth. Same with Afro-Colombian women from Northern Cauca in the same region that are mobilizing to defend their territories against mining and expansion of cane and so forth. And that says that territories and life are not sold, they are loved and defended. And again, in this representation, this was a sort of the image, the drawing that they did for one of the main mobilizations a few years ago. We find this interdependence between women and people and humans and the river and mining and the mountain and obviously the buildings and the ways of inhabiting and the fish. So it's a beautiful and sophisticated representation of the idea of radical relationality or radical interdependence. I'm going to skip this. It's about, just wanted to say something about cities, but I'm going to skip it. We might talk about that in the question and answer period. And just a couple of minutes of concluding. So the idea that we are all designers, and this is a genuine idea that is coming out of critical design studies, and we're also all design, so that we have to take responsibility for the worlds that we create anywhere, interrupt the global project of fitting our worlds into one, and this transition design approach as a praxis for healing the web of life, sketch at a time, stitch at a time, collectively. And design or anthropology or post-development as an invitation for us to become a mindful and effective weavers of the mesh of life. That this is about repairing and weaving the web of the weave of life, or the web of life. I'm going to skip this, and I thought I had another one different from this. No. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to leave you with this. I had another slide that I missed, that I failed to include, that basically say the transitions are already here, and that the mandate for all of us should then be to engage with those transitions because they are already happening. Okay, thank you.